Hey guys, it's Makeshift. I'd like to share some tips on how to dye Minky. It's not something I do frequently since there are just so many colors out there now between the usual Shannon brand to others like Hope and Textiles and Big C Fabric, but occasionally there are colors that I need that just don't exist. Some notable big gaps include warm purples, a dark gray that's nearly black, and a very light gray, which I'll be demonstrating today. Dyeing Minky can be difficult since it involves a lot of trial and error to get the color that you'd like. There are many factors involved that can lead you to get slightly different results, so you have to be careful with your technique. It's also pretty time consuming, messy, relatively expensive, and it can be wasteful too. It's also going to slightly change the look of the Minky in the end, which can stand out if you're mixing it with non-dyed Minky. So for these reasons, I try to only dye Minky as a last resort. I'm going to walk you through the general process and also show you how I achieved this warm gray light Minky and all these random colors along the way, starting with just this white Minky. This whole process involved a lot of testing, so hopefully you guys can learn from my mistakes. Let's get started. Minky fabric is polyester, so you have to use a dye made for synthetic fabrics. Dyes made for natural fabrics will not work. The two most common types of dye for synthetic fabrics are Rit Dyemore and iDye Poly. Rit Dyemore is a liquid that comes in these nice containers. There are 14 standard colors, but they also have this handy color formula guide on their website that has recipes on how to achieve unique colors with their standard dyes. However, there's no true black from Rit Dyemore. The closest that you'll get is graphite, which is a very dark gray. iDye Poly comes with a pack of powder and a color intensifier that you have to add as well. There are 16 standard colors, including black. Since it's a powder, it gets pretty messy. If you don't stir it well, it's also possible that the powder won't dissolve entirely and it can leave little dots on your fabric. The smell is also significantly worse than Rit Dyemore. I'll frequently use a portion of the dye packet, and the powder form makes it a lot more difficult since you have to store it, on top of the fact that you have to try and measure out a portion of the color intensifier and then save that as well. So because of all this, I do prefer Rit Dyemore, but sometimes I use iDye Poly for colors that Rit Dyemore doesn't have standard. So iDye Poly's brown is a warmer color than Rit Dyemore's chocolate brown, and Rit Dyemore's sandstone dye also comes out more green to me than brown. You can also mix the two dyes as well, so the color possibilities are very broad. So of course you need some Minky. You do not need to use white Minky, but you should use it if you want the pure color of the dye. You could use a different color of Minky as your base to try and get a specific color. So for example, if you're looking for a warm shade, you can start with a warm colored base fabric, but don't pick a color that's too dark unless you want to go even darker, because it's best to use light colors. For example, I used this light orange mochi Minky and iDye Poly in brown to get this color for my Kasuga Ichiban doll. It was much more appropriate for a skin tone than this light orange color. I think it would have been much harder to try and get this color starting from white as opposed to starting from this light orange. The amount of fabric you'll be able to dye in one go depends on how large the pot that you purchase is. I recommend dyeing a little bit more than you think you'll need just in case you make a mistake sewing the plush. This way you don't have to do the whole dyeing process again to try and match the exact color. You should start by pre-washing your Minky. Fabric is typically treated before it's distributed and sold, so it's best to wash it beforehand to remove this. I just wash it in my machine with detergent on a cold setting. So depending on how far in advance you're pre-washing your fabric, you could go ahead and dry it or just leave it wet. But don't let it sit out for a long time if you're not planning on dyeing it right away. You'll need various other materials to dye Minky. A lot of them are cooking tools, but it's important that you use them solely for dyeing afterward. You do not want to use them for food after they touch dye. You need to protect your work surface since dyeing can be very messy. I use garbage bags, which I rip apart to get more surface area. When I've used strong colors like red and black in the past, I've noticed that the steam from the dye can color surfaces, so you might want to consider covering any areas above your stove too. You also definitely want some gloves as the dye will stain your hands. You should also wear clothes that you don't mind staining. Trust me, this process is messy. You need a heat source for the dye bath. The water needs to be very hot for the dye to be most effective. Because of this, you will need to do it on a stovetop instead of a washing machine, which is a method some people use to dye natural fabrics. I dye my fabrics in the kitchen, but if the fumes bother you or you don't have a lot of space, you could invest in a portable burner and do the work outside. This is also a good option if you're worried about making a mess. You will need a very large pot. It needs to be big enough for your fabric to move around freely. I bought a cheap 20-quart pot off of Amazon. You should look for a similar pot that you don't mind dedicating to dyeing. If you plan on dyeing large quantities of fabric, try to buy the biggest pot you can to avoid having to do multiple batches, which could produce different results if you're not careful. Start heating the water for your dye. I fill my pot about 3 inches from the top as it will boil and you'll add fabric which will raise the water level. I cover the pot and put the burner on high heat. iDye Poly instructs you to add the dye before heating the water, so you would add the powder and intensifier at this point in your desired quantity. They also say that the water should come to a rolling boil. For Rit Dyemore, your water should be at least 200 degrees. Once the water reaches this temperature, you add the dye. I have a thermometer for taking the temperature of the water. I don't dedicate this to dyeing since I use it before any is added. But if you want to more closely monitor the temperature while you dye, buy one just for dyeing. I'd say this is optional since you can just look at the water to gauge how hot it is, but if you want consistent results, it's better to use a thermometer. This is right before the water reaches the boiling point. You should hear the water steaming and you should see a lot of bubbles. Once you reach the desired temperature, turn the heat to medium and maintain the simmer and leave the pot uncovered. The instructions of Rit Dyemore also recommend adding a teaspoon of dish soap to promote even dyeing. If your water bubbles up from the soap, use a spoon or a ladle to get rid of the bubbles. You want to be able to see what's going on in the pot, especially if you're trying to fish out little pieces of fabric. You'll need something to stir the pot with. I use wooden skewers I had lying around the house to stir my pot. I've also used wooden spoons and dowels in the past, but any dark colors can permanently sink into the wood. I've noticed that reusing them can cause the dye to seep back out and color what you're working on, so be careful reusing these items. I find it absolutely crucial to test your dye first. You'd be surprised at how different the colors turn out from what you expect and even the color that you see in the water. I cut out little squares of fabric to put in my dye. It should be the exact same fabric that you're trying to dye in the end. You should not use a different brand or color of Minky. You'll need a way to keep track of what was done to each sample. I would not recommend marking them with a pen as the pen can be removed, but it can also leak into the dye and change the color. If you're trying to test out different time spent in the dye, when you take the samples out, cut little notches into them to keep track of how long they were in the dye. For example, if it was left in for 1 minute, cut 1 notch. If 2 minutes, cut 2 notches. I wouldn't recommend doing this before putting them in the water since you'll have to try and find the exact little sample that you're looking for in the water, which can be difficult. Again, the fabric should be wet before adding it to the dye. I rinse it in warm water to try and help the temperature from dropping significantly. I keep it in one of the plastic bowls I have dedicated to dyeing next to my dyeing pot. If you're using Rit Dyemore, prepare your dye. Make sure to wear gloves. Shake the bottle well. Add your dye in the desired amount. This is where trial and error begins. The color you get is mostly dependent on how much dye you use and how long you leave it in. Temperature is also a factor, but I didn't experiment with this as much. So how much dye should you use? Well, that depends on the color and the intensity that you're going for. If you're just using a standard dye without mixing in other colors, you can add a portion of the bottle or the packet. The Rit Dyemore instructions say to use a whole bottle for a pound of polyester fabric. I typically don't use an entire bottle for dyeing Minky. I find that the Minky soaks up the dye very easily. If you're trying to get a very concentrated dark color like red, try using a smaller portion of the bottle, like half of it. If the fabric doesn't come out as dark as you'd like, you can take the fabric out, add more dye, and then add the fabric back in. If you're trying to get a very light color, try using a small amount of dye. It's better to add a very small amount like a teaspoon or a tablespoon and add more as needed rather than a fourth or a half of a bottle. If you're trying to get a specific color formula from Rit's website, follow the ratio provided. The ratio should hold through smaller amounts, so if you're trying to get a light version, try reducing the overall volume of dye. I have a set of teaspoons and measuring cups dedicated to dyeing. These are important if you're following the Rit Dyemore color formulas or if you're trying to get a very light color where you'll need to add a very small amount of dye. I also have a small syringe that I use for measuring as well. This shows you just how little dye you can use to still get a different color. Add your wet samples to the dye. You should stir continuously for the most even result, especially if you're only dyeing the Minky for a couple minutes. The instructions of Rit Dyemore say that the first 10 minutes are the most crucial. So if you plan on leaving it in for a long time, you can probably get away with stopping the continuous stirring after this amount of time, but make sure to stir it every once in a while. But ultimately, how long should you leave it in for? Well, that also depends. It's important to keep in mind that once washed, your fabric will turn out lighter than it appears when it's wet. Try taking out your samples at different times, 30 seconds, a minute, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, etc. The amount of time left in depends on how dark you want your fabric to be. One important thing to keep in mind with Minky is that it has a nap. During my experiments, I found that if I didn't leave the Minky in for long enough, only the nap got dyed but the fabric backing did not, leaving a strange two-toned effect. This could make for some cool effects, but it wasn't what I wanted. If you find this happening, try diluting your dye more and leaving it in for a longer time to allow the backing to dye as well. Take out your samples and mark them according to the time they were left in. You need to wash out the extra dye first before putting them in your washing machine. If you have a utility sink, I recommend that you use it, especially if you're using dark concentrated colors because it can stain your sink. You need to rinse the fabric until the water runs clear. Depending on what color you're using, this could be a quick single rinse like I did here, or it could take a long time. When I dyed fabric red in the past, it took a long time before all the extra was rinsed out. Then you need to put the fabric in the washing machine. When washing and drying samples, you can use a laundry bag so they don't get lost. Use laundry detergent as normal. When it's done, you can try wringing out the excess water to see if it runs clear. If it's not, you need to put it back in for another cycle. Again, when I've dyed red in the past, it took me 4 cycles to get it to run clear. If you don't have a washing machine, you can wash it by hand. You should still use laundry detergent and make sure that you're being thorough. When you're sure that the excess dye has washed out, put the fabric in the dryer. Dry it on low heat. You can use a dryer sheet if you'd like. I found it takes 20 minutes or less to dry the fabric. You can also just air dry the fabric. If you like the color of your samples, you can go ahead and dye your fabric for the desired amount of time. But can you reuse the same dye bath that you use for your sample? Well, if the bulk of your bath is still there, as in you didn't leave your stove on while you washed it, then you can go ahead and reheat your dye. Though sometimes I found that the same dye bath that I dyed my samples in did not dye my fabric at all. It was as if the tiny samples had soaked up all of my dye in the 20 quarts of water. If this happens, you can just remake the dye bath like you did the first time. If most of your dye bath is gone, then you should remake the dye bath using the same ratio and the same temperature that you got from your samples. This is the safest, most reliable method to get the same results. Once you're done dyeing all your fabric, you can take out your fabric from the dye bath. I have a large pair of tongs that I use to pull the fabric out of the pot. After you rinse out the first excess, you can just use the same washing method that you did for your samples to finish off the fabric. But once your fabric is dried, you will need to iron your Minky. You'll find that the nap has gotten messed up throughout the process. You need to be careful about the amount of heat you apply from your iron, as you can melt the fibers of the Minky. But you don't need to be too careful. I put my iron on the lowest setting that produces steam. Start by ironing the back of the Minky. Iron with the nap, not against it. Once you get the wrinkles out, turn it around and now iron the front of the Minky. You can start by using a cover so you're not directly ironing the nap. I just use an old pillowcase. Iron with the nap. If the nap still isn't straight, iron directly on the Minky. Don't keep the iron in one place for too long. If it's still giving you issues, which may happen in small areas, you can use a comb to brush out the nap and to try it to get it straight. Sometimes it helps if you brush against the grain until you see the little knots brush out, and then you can brush it back with the grain, then iron it again. Now you should have some nice dyed Minky and you can finish your project. Continue watching the video if you'd like to see my adventures in trying to get a color formula for light gray warm Minky. For my commission, I needed light gray warm Minky since there is no color between white and platinum Minky. I also wanted it to be warm in nature as the color scheme of the character was mostly warm colors. I originally started with trying to make this mist color from the Rit color formulas, which was a nice warm gray. It was just a little too dark, so I needed it to be a little less concentrated in the end, so I planned on leaving it in for a short amount of time. It calls for 1.5 teaspoons of royal purple and 3/4 teaspoon of chocolate brown. So I made the dye bath, and no matter how long I kept it in, it was coming out too dark, too cool, and it didn't really look very close to what was on the website. So I decided to back up and just try the normal frost gray Rit Dyemore. But again, it was coming out way too cool, and it was basically just blue no matter how long I left it in the dye, and even these are just a few seconds, around 30 seconds in the dye. So I looked up some more color formulas and I found this down feathers recipe which involved frost gray and sandstone dye. And the cup measurement was way too much for the light color I was looking for, so I reduced it to 1.5 teaspoons of frost gray and a 1/4 teaspoon of sandstone. However, what I got was a very light green. I should have seen this coming because I tried to use sandstone in the past to dye my Mochi Minky for my Kasuga Ichiban doll, and it also came out green tinted. There's just something about this dye that, in combination with Minky, makes it come out green tone instead of brown. So then my saving grace arrived, my fellow plush maker, Shattered Needle. They make incredible Transformers plushies and they work primarily in Alova suede, which doesn't have many colors, so they pretty much have to dye all of their colors themselves. Please check out Shattered Needle. All the work they do is incredible and it always blows my mind the amount of detail that they're able to get in such small plushies. Shattered Needle shared to use graphite and orange to get a warm gray Minky with Rit Dyemore. I started with a 3:1 ratio of graphite to orange. I used 3/4 teaspoon of graphite and 1/4 teaspoon of orange. And despite just leaving it in the dye for a short amount of time, it was still coming out pretty dark and pretty blue. So this was 30 seconds in the dye bath and this was 10 seconds in the dye bath. And I was still getting that phenomenon where the back of the Minky was not taking but the nap was. So you can see this has a bit of a white undertone. So then I increased the ratio to 1:1 graphite to orange, and I was getting a little closer, but it was still too cool for my liking. Since I knew I needed to make it warmer, I needed to add more orange, so I added another 1/4 teaspoon of orange to avoid having to remake my dye bath and waste more water and more dye. I knew it would come out more concentrated, but if I liked the color, I could just add less of it to the water. So what I got with a 2:1 ratio of orange to graphite was this color, but the phenomenon where the backing wasn't dyeing the same color as the nap was very apparent here, where the backing was basically orange and the nap was this warm gray color that I actually really liked. So again, I think you could probably get some really neat effects here like this if you mess around with it, but this is not what I was going for. That meant that I needed to have a much smaller quantity of dye in my dye bath. So to do that, I just broke out a syringe that I had laying around to get a very small amount of dye into my dye bath, but still be able to control the ratio. I wanted to use the very smallest amount I could, which would be just the first 2 lines on this syringe, and 2 lines is about equal to 1/4 of a milliliter according to this syringe. So I ended up using 1/4 of a milliliter of orange and 1/8 of a milliliter of graphite. So when I left in fabric for about 3 minutes with that small amount of dye, I got this color, which was a very nice light warm gray Minky that matched the rest of the colors of Minky that I was using. So I was very happy with the results, and that was all thanks to Shattered Needle. And here it is next to the white and platinum Minky, which are the 2 colors that I wanted it to land between, and I think that's exactly what I've got here. The color is nice and consistent, the Minky is still soft, and the pile is smooth thanks to the ironing we did. It is a bit shinier than it used to be, which is one of the texture implications that I talked about when dyeing the Minky. And this is probably due to the heat of the water altering the finish of the fabric, but it's not very noticeable overall. If it really bothers you, you can try dyeing it at a lower temperature water, but it may affect how the fabric takes the dye. If you'd like a guide on gradient dyeing, you can check out an old tutorial that I made years ago on DeviantArt, which I'll link in the description. And maybe one day I'll get around to making a video tutorial for that. If you enjoyed this video and you'd like to see more plush making content, please make sure to like and subscribe. Thanks for watching and good luck with your dyeing endeavors.